My name's Wendy Fenton, and I'm the coordinator of the Humanitarian Practice Network here at the Overseas Development Institute. And I'd like to welcome all of you and our online audience. I believe we've got at least 120 people signed up to watch online today, which is great, to today's event. And I know most of you will know that in July 2014, humanitarian agencies and the government of Somalia raised the alarm of a new possible severe drought in Somalia 3 years after the deadly famine that killed more than 250,000 people. Now today we'll be discussing a new paper by Dan Maxwell and Nisar Majid entitled Another Humanitarian Crisis in Somalia, Learning from the 2011 Famine. And the paper highlights findings from a retrospective analysis of the 2011-12 famine in Somalia and in the region more broadly, which has been conducted by Tufts and the Rift Valley Institute. And one of the key questions raised and discussed in the paper, and that we're going to discuss more today, is whether any of the lessons that we think we've learned are actually being put into practice now. So before I introduce our panel, I just wanted to go through a bit of housekeeping. If you could put your phones on silent, we'd appreciate that, but feel free to tweet. So the hashtag, it's hashtag Somalia, I believe. It's up on the screen. And do hold your questions and comments until we open the floor for discussion after we have the discussion here on the panel. And I hope that those of you in the room will be able to join us for a sandwich lunch afterwards and more discussion and networking. So now let me introduce our panel. On my immediate right is Dan Maxwell, who is a professor and research director at the Feinstein International Center at Tufts University, and he's a co-author of the paper that we're discussing today. Before joining the faculty at Tufts, he was a deputy regional director for CARE in Eastern and Central Africa, and he's also worked at the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, the Land Tenure Center and Mennonite Central Committee. And on Dan's right is Nisar Majid, who is a visiting fellow at the Feinstein International Center, and he's the other co-author of today's paper. And Nisar has been working in the development and humanitarian fields for over 15 years, primarily in the Horn of Africa, with a particular focus on Somalia. His initial working experience was in food security and livelihoods analysis and training, and frequently within the early warning information systems of Ethiopia, Somalia, and Kenya. And then on my immediate left is Laura Hammond, and she's the head of department and reader of development studies at SOAS University. And she's been working in the Horn of Africa since 1993, when I think we first met in Ethiopia, and in Somali territory since 1998, first as a development worker and then as an academic. Laura's work focuses on livelihoods and food security, as well as migration, displacement, diasporas, and conflict and humanitarian assistance. And she's a recognized expert on Somalia. So I'd like to now hand over to Dan and Nisar, but before that I need to introduce our colleagues in Nairobi. So we're very lucky to have with us today in Nairobi Khalif Abdirahman and Guhad Muhammad Aden, who both worked for Tufts and RVI on this study in Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya. Welcome. I hope you can hear us. We can see you. Khalif has also conducted research for humanitarian outcomes on their cash and vouchers program and conducted research for the International Crisis Group in Ethiopia. Guhad has worked on Somali humanitarian issues since 1993. So very experienced and senior researchers who are going to read some testimonies from Somali people later on in the event. Dan, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Okay, thanks very much, Wendy, and thank you everyone for joining us here today. What we're going to try and do today really is summarize a fairly wide-ranging study that we've been undertaking for the last several years. There is a paper that came out on this, that came out actually a few months ago, that summarizes some of the highlights and puts it in the context of some renewed early warnings about crisis in the Horn of Africa. But what we'd really like to do is just touch on a number of highlights from a very wide-ranging study that's touched on a number of things. This kind of goes back to work that that Khalif and Nisar and I did in 2012, evaluating one of the more innovative responses to the 2011 famine, which was the unconditional cash transfer program. And as we were conducting that evaluation, we were struck by, on the one hand, how much information and data and reports and evaluations, et cetera, there was about some aspects of that crisis, and how little we knew about other aspects of that crisis. So we undertook this study to try and, first of all, make sense out of all that mountain of information that we did have, and then also try to address some of the severe gaps in understanding about other things. The study was funded by the Gates Foundation and by the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance of the USAID, and was conducted in collaboration with Rift Valley Institute. Let's see, how do I make this thing work? Is that correct? No, that's not doing it. Is that doing it?
There you go.
So in the background there, you can see at least a part of our field team, including Khalif and Guhad and Mark Bradbury from Rift Valley Institute and several others. The elements that we were trying to address that we thought were relatively understudied was, first of all, we all know that the famine was responded to in a rather late way and only in certain areas, and that there were whole areas of the most badly affected parts of Somalia where little humanitarian assistance actually reached. So one of our questions was, what happened in those areas? How did people cope? What were the responses of local communities, of the business community, of diasporas, et cetera? And then the second element of it had to do with a whole range of agencies and actors that were involved in responding to the famine, but who had, for the most part, not been involved in a large way in humanitarian activities in Somalia before. So a number of names have sort of come up to talk about this group category of humanitarian actors, non-traditional or emerging, et cetera. None of these labels fits very well, but we were interested in the experience of and the contribution of that group of humanitarian actors. So speaking in particularly about Turkish agencies, about agencies from Gulf states like Qatar in particular, but also Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, et cetera, and Islamic networks that maybe were not necessarily based in any particular country, but served to mobilize a lot of resources for the response. There are a lot of ways that one could depict the course of a crisis, and there are a lot of ways that we have chosen to do this in other stuff that will be coming out shortly. But one way is to try and depict the impact of the crisis and the response of to the crisis. So this graph, which was painstakingly difficult to construct actually, traces three things. The green line shows you the mortality from the famine in terms of thousands of people per month. You have to read that left-hand scale and multiply it by 100, because there's two different things going on that left-hand scale. So as you can see, excess mortality, or people who were dying as a result of the crisis, was already elevated in 2010, and it skyrocketed with the failure of the GU rains in March, April of 2011, and was actually over 30,000 people per month by the time the famine was declared. And then it tails off fairly rapidly through the second half of 2011. The blue line shows the cumulative level of funding towards the crisis in Somalia, and as you can see, it's sort of sputtering along until the famine is declared in July of 2011, after which it ratchets up significantly. And the red line shows the number of people who are receiving some kind of food assistance, and that also goes up quite quickly after the declaration of the famine. So this, on the one hand, depicts the sort of early warning and late response phenomenon, or at least the late response phenomenon. All through the first half of 2011, there were a series of not only regular early warning reports, but also sort of extraordinary or unusual reports that highlighted the nature of the problem. And yet, as you can see, the response doesn't really pick up until after the declaration. Another way of trying to depict the course of the crisis is by looking at the indicators of the magnitude of it. In a crisis like this, where there was a production crisis and people lost subsistence production, people had to rely on markets for access to food. So one way of depicting the impact of the crisis is to look at the comparison between what people had to sell and the price they had to pay to buy food to survive. So the two main commodities that one would look at in terms of this terms of trade issue is labor, or casual wages, and small ruminants. And this graph here shows the relationship between what one can earn from a day's casual labor expressed in terms of kilograms of grain. And as you can see, throughout 2010, it bounces around and is quite different between different regions. But all three regions go over a sort of a cliff in the autumn of 2010 and remain in that valley down there where purchasing power is about 1/4 or 1/3 what it had been before, up until the time the famine is declared. And then throughout the autumn of 2011, terms of trade rapidly improve again as the rains returned, agricultural labor opportunities became more available, and globally the price of food went down rather rapidly. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to note that if you superimpose that curve with the one on the previous slide, you'd see that this exactly mirrors the mortality from the famine. And indeed, it's a little bit difficult to sort out what brought the mortality down in the second half of 2011. A major humanitarian response was ramping up, but also terms of trade and labor opportunities were improving. At the time, there was a general consensus that we knew fairly well what was coming at us, and that for a variety of reasons we did not respond. One of the graphs that we're not showing you this morning here in the interest of time is all of the sort of extraordinary early warnings that came out in early 2011. But we did show you the response in terms of not really kicking in until after the declaration. So one of our interests was in trying to explore a little bit why this was. And in many ways, some of the old explanations that have been around since the groundbreaking work that Margie Buchanan Smith and Susanna Davies did on this topic 20 years ago still exist. Senior humanitarian leaders felt like they did not have the credibility or the clout to push very much harder for an early response than they already were, and that was not adequate to significantly ramp up the response until after the declaration. But there was a whole new category of things around counterterrorism regulations, legal risks, and reputational risks to agencies and indeed to individuals that in many ways also contributed to the problem of late response. There was, in the case of the U.S., this is referred to as the OFAC regulations, or the Office of Foreign Asset Controls. And the Office of Foreign Asset Controls did grant a license, partially granting immunity from some of these restrictions, but only after the famine was declared. In retrospect, a number of things have come up that we'll talk about a little bit more later on in terms of lessons learned on this notion of early response. And they include things like embedding triggers and trigger indicators into early warning systems, and then linking those triggers directly to not only contingency planning, but actual forms of response and mitigation. And to address this problem of humanitarian leaders being a little bit leery of the Chicken Little syndrome, a whole new category of things referred to, at least in Nairobi, as no regrets programming has come up as well. And no regrets programming refers to things that could be done to mitigate the onset of a crisis, but which would turn out to still be useful investments, even if a large-scale crisis doesn't emerge. The third category of things is around crisis modifiers, or budget lines that sit in ongoing programs of various kinds, development programs or what have you, but which can be quickly tapped into if circumstances begin to change on the ground. They don't require a whole new round of the usual sort of humanitarian program cycle of assessments and appeals and fundraising and et cetera. It's money that can be used quite quickly. And the fourth thing, which grows out more of the experience of the same crisis, the same drought and food price crisis, but in in Kenya and Ethiopia, has to do with the notion of scalable social safety nets, or programs that exist to address the particular needs of vulnerable people, even in relatively good years, but which can quickly be scaled up in response to a worsening situation in bad years. And there are also some issues around regional information and information sharing around population movements that we can perhaps go into in a bit more detail later on. Nisar, over to you.
Yeah, we were also keen to try and understand the multiple roles that Al-Shabaab had played in the run-up to and during the famine. And understanding Al-Shabaab provides a variety of different insights. And it was certainly the case that Al-Shabaab ensured security, including for aid operations, and that many agencies commented on this as a positive feature and contrasted it with the role of government. Al-Shabaab also at times demonstrated targeting aid resources to the poorest people in the community, in contrast again to the established way of working by aid actors, where resources are targeted along the lines of clan power dynamics. But that said, those insights said Al-Shabaab's role was no doubt extremely detrimental, including restricting access by humanitarian agencies, which people are familiar with and which populations that we spoke to on the ground very much pointed out. But also important to realise is how much Al-Shabaab interfered with restrictions from all other actors, including the Somali private sector, the diaspora, and aid that's organised at the level of the clan. So they were very much trying to control all aspects of aid deliveries. Another important way in which Al-Shabaab influenced events in 2011 was taxation, both of the urban and especially of the rural economy. And this resulted in the flight of much of the wealthier segment of the population in many areas over the preceding months and years. And this, we think, weakened social redistribution mechanisms, which is very much a strength of Somali society. So literally a kind of class of people, the wealthier people within areas had moved out, and that their resources weren't as available to be redistributed to the poor in times of need. Al-Shabaab also claimed zakat for themselves, and the extent to which this was redistributed to the poor is not clear. And they restricted the mobility of very weakened populations in 2011, and therefore made the journey that people had to make to access aid resources, whether in Mogadishu or in Kenya and Ethiopia, much more difficult. They imposed trade blockades in some areas, increasing prices, and they restricted information from some of the worst hit areas. So they had multiple roles. The Western humanitarian response, so one of the defining features really of the response in 2011 was that of a very large cash-based response in the absence of WFP and food aid. And this was subject to quite a big debate in 2011 about the appropriateness of cash. There was already quite a big evidence base about how well cash has worked in Somalia, although at a very different scale, much smaller level programs. But as you can see from the figures there, the cost effectiveness of cash compares very favourably to food aid. And there are specific features of the Somali economy that make this happen, and the strength of the Hawala system, the strength of the trading networks are all very much part of making cash a very viable option, as it proved to be in 2011. Shall we move on? Okay, we're going to turn to Guhad and Khalif in Nairobi, who are going to read out a couple of the narratives. So we conducted over 400 interviews with affected communities on the ground, many of whom were in areas that were inaccessible at the time in 2011, and some of which were inaccessible apart from by phone for research purposes. So the first is a Laysan clansperson of the Rahan Wain, speaking from Baidoa, and the second is a lady, Jarer, Somali Bantu person that we contacted in Jamame. So Guhad, I think you're going to read first.
Yeah, thank you very much. And we start reading the narrative of the Laysan clansman from Baidoa. This is what this Laysan man has been saying when he was interviewed. Our family keeps cattle, some camel, but not many, and we farm. As a family, we have many people who are able and can work and sell labor to farms during the farming periods. This is called Tab Gosi. We had good sesame harvest in good 2010. In general, farming practices in Bai region have changed since when the TFG settled in Baidoa 2006 to 2010. The changes the change was towards increasing growing of cash crop, sesame and groundnuts. Before the drought of 2011, livestock herds increased too much, but reduced to almost zero because of the drought, especially cattle. I have invested to buy 10 good-looking cows. I have used good amount of my money for my son's marriage and dowry. Yes, we had a relatively good amount of sorghum reserve when the drought started. Things were well and in order. Unfortunately, the 2010-2011 drought failed. From February to April 2011, there was a very hot Jilal. We had no water, but we were getting some water trucked from Baidoa. I don't know who exactly was paying for this water. Because there is no livestock feed stocks from sesame. The cattle we had and goats had nothing to feed on. We had to give part of the animals, part of the sorghums we had, and share it between people and livestock. When the sorghum was out of stock, we started giving the livestock the grass that were on top of our huts, which were making the roofs of the huts. The stress continued. Number of meals and amount started reducing. This was the beginning of January 2011 and onwards. Cattle started dying by February 2011, and by the end of April, it was almost finished. By May, people started becoming IDPs. By May 2011, people started becoming IDPs, moving to different places. For our case, we divided the family into 3 groups. One group went to Doro, Ethiopia refugee camp. One group went to Baidoa, especially the weaker ones. And the last group stayed and moved with a camel and a few goats because we had some lactating camel. I was part of the group that went to Baidoa. We moved to Baidoa June 2011. I went to some clan members in Baidoa to assist me and save my family. They assisted me with some food that was enough for at least 1 month. I also found some aid that was done by Baidoa Business Group and Al-Shabaab. Later, there was some aid from ICRC and Al-Shabaab. All my family members are in Baidoa district, and I don't have any family member in other countries that I can cry to, but there are some clan members in Baidoa town that I can cry to for some assistance. Households with many cattle and were farmers were the worst affected. The pure farmers were all affected as they bought a lot of animals during the previous years. People with many children, old people and sick people were also affected very much. Children and old people were those who died most. I have seen myself, a family with more than 10 children, 4 of them died in 2 days. People who had nobody to cry to, that is, don't have kinsmen to help them, don't have sons or daughters in the towns or out of the country to help. All such people were not able to cope with. In terms of clan, the drought affected the following clans more than the other clans: the Gelede, the Yantar, the Huber, and the Jirer from other clans. These are all the strong producers of sorghum in Bai region. Yantar and Huber had a very bad conflict in 2007-2008. This affected their reserves. They also did intensive sesame growth. For our case, we were also affected very much in our village, but the number of people who died were not many. Because as a clan, the Laisans, we could not let our clan members die of hunger while we know and we have something. The Laisans in Baidoa and even in other places were collecting money to help us. Thank you.
And this is the account of a Jarer Yamal woman in the countryside of Jamame district. I am Jarer Yamal. They say we are Yamal, but I really see myself as Jarer only. I'm married with 6 children. We have farm and keep livestock. We normally grow maize in our farm. Rains and river flooding are important for our farm. Before the crisis, we had 25 sheep and goats. My husband took the goats and sheep to faraway places to save them from dying. In the end, all perished except 7. This meant the job of saving our 6 children was left to me. I first went to Jamame town, where I ground maize for other people who paid me in money. I then moved to Kismayo, where I moved in with a woman whom I knew before. She took me around to show me all the places where I could find cheap food. Then she showed me my many families whom I could work for. I was washing clothes, cleaning houses, cleaning front courts, and doing many more labor work. The woman has really helped me out by showing me around, finding me accommodation and jobs, and in the end saying, here you are, I showed you around, and it's up to you to make sure that you and your children survive. Most of the people moved to the refugee camps in Kismayo. Some walked all the way to Mogadishu, and some went to Kismayo, most of the people moved to the refugee camps in Kenya. Some walked all the way to Mogadishu, and some went to Kismayo. But most of the people went to Kenya. Thanks to God, I have not lost any of my children. They all have survived and are with me now. On the other hand, those who fled to Kenya have lost many of their children on their way to Kenya. And
Guhad. So I think these narratives, of which we've got several hundred, are very important, and they're very moving. You get a real sense of what was going on at the time, and there was a lot of deaths around within people's families and what people could see around. They're also very important because a lot of the time when we are looking at Somalia, we see Somalia through very technical reports that are where the human content is removed, and actually a lot of the time we're not even in Somalia at all. So it's very important, I think, that we can hear those kind of voices. So as well as the emotional content, if you want, they're very important also analytically for what they tell us about Somali coping mechanisms, actually, and Somali livelihoods. And there's the 3 different characteristics that we've picked upon. That's diversification, flexibility, and social connectedness, which again are concepts that are not often captured very well by in other types of livelihoods analysis. And you got a little bit of a sense in those interviews of some of these characteristics. So, for example, in the first interview, the Laysan person talked about the diversification of livestock. He had camels and cattle as well as small ruminants, and the household was split up. Diversification in terms of, or mobility in terms of dividing up the household and going to 3 different places in order to gather resources or to access resources, and also in terms of social connectedness, actually. And we've adopted a clan or a socio-political lens to try to understand what was going on in 2011. And again, the first interviewee talks very much, or stresses the importance of his clan, the Laysan clan, as in terms of protecting him and protecting his family. And we've got a lot of other examples, and we can talk a lot about a lot of other different clans or social groups, and start to understand how processes of diversification have developed over time, actually, from government times, and how they're a function of urbanization, education, migration, formation of diaspora communities, formation of business communities, and altogether bound up within social networks and social connections. These provide people with differing abilities to cope in very difficult times. So interesting to hear that. And to change the subject completely, to move on to this category of actors that Dan mentioned at the beginning is quite difficult actually to define, and emerging includes many different actors. We are particularly focusing on Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the other Gulf states, and the various charities and NGOs that come from those countries. So that's our limitation. And these actors are expanding very much as humanitarian donors and as humanitarian agencies, and in other ways, new hubs and platforms have been created in different places in the Gulf, relevant to the humanitarian world. But they are a very heterogeneous group. One doesn't need to, I mean, that's clear if you think about the different types of countries there, and even the different types of charities and NGOs from those countries are very varied. At a general level, one can talk about that group in terms of having an Islamic identity, drawing upon principles of Islamic charity, which inform their actions in different ways and also very much in varied ways. It's a way of getting finance, and there is a Muslim solidarity around that. The types of projects, the types of activities that these actors are involved in are also a function of principles of Islamic charity. Now, many Islamic charities and NGOs from this category were present in Somalia and have been since the early 1990s and even before that. And many others actually came to Somalia for the first times, but particularly you could highlight the Turkish, not all of the Turkish agencies, but most of them who arrived in Somalia after the famine was declared. And you know, there's very much an emphasis and an interesting difference between the way that people talk about the informants from this group about their solidarity, being in Mogadishu, being in southern Somalia, and being with the people. And that's a very big contrast from if you compare with Western organisations who are much further removed. And there are certain risks that they took and that they suffered, if you want, as a result of that presence on the ground. But there was a sense in which they were very close to the people. They worked through more trusted networks in terms of their long-term work in the country. It's not quite clear how much that was applicable with this huge and very fast scaling up during 2011, just because there was such a huge emergency. But maybe we could talk about that a little bit more afterwards.
Okay, thanks. Just to wrap up, the question that Wendy put at the beginning of the hour was, what did we learn from all of this experience, and is there any evidence that we're actually putting that learning into practice? And when we say we here, I guess we are sort of speaking in the royal we, but we're talking about the humanitarian community at large. That includes the kinds of actors that Nisar was just speaking about, and it also includes the kinds of activities and actions that took place outside of the formally organized humanitarian community with the diaspora and so forth. But here we're really focusing on the sort of formal international humanitarian community. We had a little workshop in Nairobi with our entire team last summer, and we asked everybody to do a sort of a brainstorming activity, and we came up with something like 32 things that we thought were key learning, not necessarily things that were new or exclusive to the experience of 2011. If you look at this list, you can see lots of things here that you would say, well, gosh, we knew that long before 2011. But the point was, there was no way we could have come through the crisis of 2011 without these things coming to our attention, without having to deal with these in some way. So whether or not they were there before 2011, they should definitely be on the list now. And just to highlight a couple of these things, I've already mentioned these, but you know, the use of triggers, and particularly forward-looking triggers, crisis modifiers, and no regrets kind of programs. Early warning and analysis that's sensitive to the issues of social and political identity, that's sensitive to local networks, etc. And then a number of factors around risk management. The list itself is relatively unremarkable, but what we tried to do was get access to the proposals or the program plans that have been put in place since the famine, and looked at those to see, are these things actually being put into practice? Are they being discussed? Are they being proposed, et cetera? Recognizing that, of course, you can say something in a proposal, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to go well in practice on the ground. But if it's not even in the proposal, chances are it doesn't stand a very good chance of going particularly well on the ground. Some agencies, some donors were willing to share these kind of proposals and program plans with us. Others were not. So we do not, by any means, have an exhaustive or even representative sample. We're pretty sure that what we saw are the better proposals, maybe the best ones, only the ones that got funded, et cetera. What we did was then go through all of these proposals and try to somehow sort of score them. So if something wasn't mentioned at all, it got scored 0 for that proposal. If it was mentioned but only sort of in passing and it wasn't really clear how it was going to be implemented, we scored it 1. And if it was clearly described and clearly explained how it was going to be implemented, we scored it 2. So out of the limited handful of proposals that we could get, the total possible score here was something like 44. And as you can see, some of these things, I'm sorry, that's actually kind of small to see at this range. But things like scalable safety nets are being discussed quite a bit, and in many cases being put in place, constrained in Somalia by the fact that these are very much localized sort of safety nets. There's no national program. The use of triggers is being talked about quite a lot, but the use of forward-looking triggers, or triggers that will actually link into forward-looking early warning kind of information, is considerably less than the discussion about triggers. So a little bit of a question about did we really get what triggers are, what they're about, et cetera. Less on crisis modifiers, and surprisingly less on the issue of no regrets, even though that was a term that was on everyone's lips in Nairobi in 2012. What's interesting to us, though, is that the area in which the most progress seems to have been made is in the area of risk management, and particularly in measures that counter fraud and diversion. And it was the fear, of course, of fraud and diversion and formal aid, formal assistance ending up in the hands of proscribed groups like Al-Shabaab that was one of the major contributors to the late response in 2011. So that's an area in which there's been apparently a lot of progress made, a lot of discussion about it, and a lot of attempts to put things into practice. Surprisingly less around some of the other things here, the do no harm element, the elements of staff safety, of beneficiary safety, et cetera, all categories of risk management that score lower on our little scorecard here. It was clear to us that the risks of engaging in Somalia were severe enough that somehow or other those risks had to be shared between donors, intermediary agencies, and local partners. And yet, much of that risk sort of cascaded down this row of relationships, and that led to a lot of risk-averse behavior on the part of humanitarian agencies in 2011. So some element of risk sharing or dividing up that risk seemed to us to be an important element for improved response in the future. And if you notice, that one happens to score 0 on our little scorecard here. Something to think about. The last point we'd just like to make is one that is particularly now with regard to the Western, more or less Nairobi-based humanitarian community. And it's quite clear that in the years since the famine, there is a kind of a malaise, we can't think of a better word for it, amongst the humanitarian community in Nairobi, a sense that the system as we have it is not really fit for purpose in Somalia. It's fragmented. There are high levels of mistrust. There is limited information sharing. And striking to us was the difference in the tone between the mountains and mountains of reports that we read through, which admitted that there was a problem in 2011, but gave the impression that we had learned our lessons from that. Those lessons are now being taken on board, and we were good to go for the future. But a much more doubtful sense that we got from interviewing people in person about that. a sense that perhaps we hadn't learned our lessons as well as we could, and in fact there are structural impediments to learning those lessons and putting in place better ways of doing things. The competitive nature of funding and the declining levels of funding certainly make this problem more difficult. High levels of staff turnover, as well as the sort of remote management nature of much of this, means that lessons have to be relearned, often the hard way, by new people. And there is lots of anecdotal evidence of continuing aid diversion or elite capture of aid, the capture of aid by people that don't really need it. And this has kind of led to a phenomenon that we first began slightly in jest speaking of, and then later perhaps more seriously began referring to as Nairobi public secrets, as things that everyone knows, but everyone is reluctant to talk about, especially in public. It wasn't unusual for us to be interviewing humanitarian aid workers, but when a sensitive point came up, for that person to be looking around and see who might be listening in to what he or she was about to say. Or in a couple of other notable cases, speaking with more than one at once, and when one was about to be too frank, the other one would clap his or her hands over their ears because they didn't want to hear what was about to be said, as if knowing about aid diversion or about some of these, dealing with some of these counterterrorism restrictions was equivalent to being complicit in it. I already mentioned this business about joint risk sharing or risk taking, but it's quite clear that there is this kind of cascading system of risk outsourcing that's associated with remote management, and that in fact much of the risk ends up in the risk of physical security ends up in the hands of local aid workers on the ground. Much of the risk to reputation and the legal risk may be with the intermediary agencies. And in fact, when we made this presentation in Nairobi, a number of donors in the room insisted that actually risks were being shared equally because much of the financial risk actually remained with the donors. That is a little bit of a point of contention because there are cases in which agencies were forced to repay to donors amounts of money that had been associated with diverted aid. This all leads, of course, to a widespread sense of risk aversion that temporarily diminished after the famine was declared in 2011, but is sort of back with a vengeance now. And another element of this malaise is a sense that we aren't really playing by our own rules of the game. We're violating humanitarian principles, and in particular, this notion of impartiality is one that's very difficult to put into place in Somalia, that targeting of aid is being done according to risk criteria, not according to human need criteria, and that in fact this obvious disconnect between what we talk about and what we do with regard to aid being allocated by need is one of the reasons that actually led to some of the breakdown in relations between Al-Shabaab and other groups in the run-up to the famine. So what have we learned and what are some ways forward? We hope that we can have a broader discussion about this with all of you. In recent advances in sort of famine theory, if you will, the issue of accountability is one that plays a big role. In other words, not just what happened and why, but who was responsible for making the decisions that led to not only a production failure or a market failure, but especially a failure of response. And with regard to the question of accountability, everybody agrees that it's an important question. Everybody has someone else to blame for that. With regard to the question of learning, I think there has been a lot learned. We have some evidence of it. We have some evidence that it's being put in a position. Our fear is that we have dealt mostly with the technical issues, and that some of the political constraints, the trade-offs between the humanitarian imperative on the one hand and counterterrorism or security or political concerns on the other hand, is a discussion that we really haven't had yet. A little bit of a concern that the biggest issue on learning appears to be about how to reduce fraud. And I think probably everyone agrees that the only way to address some of these problems is to have an honest discussion about them. But there is a lot of disincentives to having that kind of public discussion. Some progress has been made. There are better ways of preventing the diversion of aid now. There certainly are programs that are implementing some of these things that turn up on our list of learning. But if the same or a similar set of circumstances were to recur in terms of the triggers of the 2011 crisis, it's not at all clear that we would be better at responding to it now than we were in 2011. So how to institutionalize this learning and how to provide the incentives for that kind of honest, both introspection and discussion and sharing learning, I think are challenges that remain with us for the future. Sorry that we ran a little bit over on time, Wendy, but thank you very much for putting up with our slight.
No, thanks very much. And thanks to Guhad and Khalif in Nairobi as well, and to the CARE Regional Office for hosting them. I'd now like to turn over to Laura to really get her sort of comments on both the report and the findings, and anything else you'd like to say based on your own experience.
Sure. Thank you. It's really been a privilege to be able to follow this research process along the path. I talked to Dan and Nisar early on in the research process, and then now to read this first report, and now to even talk about the book that will eventually come out as an expansion of the things we're talking about today has been exciting. I think there are a few sort of three main things I wanted to touch on. One was this issue of responsibility that Dan kind of finished with. And I think that the work that the team has been doing really helps us to pick apart these questions of responsibility. As he says, there's everyone who wants to play the blame game and try to point the finger of blame on someone else. But I think if you do any kind of a cursory analysis of what happened in 2010, 11, and into 12, you'll find that there is responsibility and blame to be apportioned quite broadly amongst a wide variety of actors, not just Al-Shabaab, not just the transitional federal government, the donor community, humanitarian actors as well, a whole range of actors. And that's not really the important part. I mean, obviously it's important to learn from what mistakes were made, but it's also, I think, important to recognize even where some of, the dynamics that were in place and also some of the ways in which those actors actually did try, with some effect sometimes, to try to mitigate some of the suffering. So, I mean, the analysis of Al-Shabaab and its role in this picture is much more kind of nuanced than many kinds of analyses that we've seen in the past, where the kind of popular discourse is, well, Al-Shabaab it was their fault that the famine happened, when in fact, while there is line of responsibility and there are mistakes that were made, and in some cases you can argue about whether or not they were deliberate, it's also the case that in many areas where Al-Shabaab was in place, they downplayed the clan rivalries and were able to provide assistance, as Nisar says, in a much more responsive to need in some places than in others. And that's something, I think, to be learned from. It's also the case that they were very keen to promote self-reliance and were concerned for a very long time that too much food aid would undermine this issue of self-reliance. One can argue that they misjudged the severity of the famine, in fact, and that in a way it was sort of too late to be worried about self-reliance at a time when people were really starving. But I think that important precept that famine relief should always seek to shore up people's own sense of self-reliance is really important. There's a whole area in which responsibility had different actors' responsibility played out in terms of the ways in which mobility, and the mobility is highlighted as a major kind of resource that people need to be able to rely on in times of crisis. The ways in which different actors manipulated people's ability to engage in mobility in unfortunate ways and when you follow those lines of how mobility was disrupted, you find that Al-Shabaab was guilty of that in terms of blocking people leaving Somalia, trying to prevent people from getting into Mogadishu. But the transitional federal government was also guilty of that, trying to lure people in a sense into the capital city to receive assistance, saying the only way we can help you is if you come into the IDP camps. But at the same time, there's a sort of demonstration that governance happens in those spaces where they have access, and there's this interesting interconnection between the ability to govern and to provide service and sort of manipulation, I guess, in some cases of mobility, which I think is an interesting thing to follow through. The point was made about the donors, in particular the U.S.'s granting of sort of amnesties in the sense around the OFAC regulations and the assurance which came too late to humanitarian operators by saying you can work in these areas and we won't be too concerned about whether or not resources fall into the hands of proscribed terrorists. And that sort of reassurance came too late. I think I would also argue that it was really meaningless for many, many actors. It was meaningful for the very large NGOs who had political clout and who had some kind of protection. But for the small organizations, particularly diaspora-run organizations, it didn't provide very much protection because they weren't in a position to take advantage of that kind of an amnesty that was offered. I think another really valuable part of this work is its focus on so-called non-traditional actors, which we clearly recognize are neither non-traditional nor emergent in many cases. But be that as it may, different kinds of actors than the kind of UN-dominated, very often kind of major international NGO-type actors. So new kinds of donors getting involved in humanitarian relief. It's really interesting to see that dynamic. I think that there was something like $350 million that went into Somalia during the time of the famine that went outside of the UN consolidated appeal. That's a massive amount of money, and there's not very much known about what it was. Much of it went through the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, but the constituent elements of that bundle of funds, I think there's a lot more interesting research that needs to be done, picking it apart and trying to figure out how much of that was diaspora money, for instance, how much of it was coming from organizations that had a bit more of a professional capacity, and which one was from newer donors, and what were the dynamics of those funds. You can see that I think that the diaspora role in this is quite important. I think one of the success stories, in a sense, has been that members of the diaspora who've been able to mobilize resources quickly were also able to deliver that resource very quickly. They were able to work through the Somali remittance companies and the distribution channels to get money to where it was needed, very often overnight, in ways that UN agencies and other major Western NGOs just didn't have the access and weren't able to do so. So that's an important piece, I think, that could be, that needs some attention. The other kind of second piece of this is one of the really valuable parts of this research is its focus on concrete recommendations. There have been quite a lot of lessons learned types of analyses done of what happened since 2011, and I think this is one of the pieces of work which is most useful in the sense that it really provides very concrete recommendations. The idea of no regrets options, the idea that cash distribution really works in these kinds of circumstances has been really valuable. The idea of crisis modifiers, which might not seem very exciting to many people, actually is quite exciting because development organizations, if they don't have that ability, that surge capacity, find themselves looking at need emerging and unable to respond to it in a quick way. So it's really important to have the idea of crisis modifiers. The idea as well of risk sharing, I think, is really important. The idea that you can have an absolutely foolproof, flawless situation in which risk is perfectly managed in a context like Somalia is laughable, really. But we know that in conflict situations all over the world, this is sort of the way that humanitarian relief is provided. There's always a danger of slippage, whether you're in Iraq or Sri Lanka or Afghanistan or Somalia, and to hold these places to a higher account than you would have in other kinds of contexts, I think, is unfair. And so I think really the idea of sharing risk is really, really important. The final kind of bit that I wanted to talk about was this question of the future and whether or not actually Somalia is in a better place now than it was, say, in 2010. And there's a lot to suggest in this report that many of the same kinds of pressure points are still in place, and that there's quite a high level of risk that future kind of emergency situations can unfold. I think, well, we have to recognize that many of the people who were displaced during this time period, and then the narratives that we heard from Nairobi attest to this, that much of the displacement that occurred hasn't been finalized. People are still living in displaced centers. Some people have gone back, but there's a lot of information that is still lacking about actually the extent to which they've been able to reconstitute their livelihoods, get access to their land, really start to become productive again in these areas. And it's quite worth reminding ourselves that this is an area of Somalia which should be the breadbasket of the country, between the two rivers, the most agriculturally productive area of the country. There's really, this should be the last place that there is a famine. So the question of where the vulnerabilities lie in terms of the future have to really, I think, be a lot more focused on these questions of what's happened to people's resilience. Have they been able to recapture it and to reestablish it through returning to their land and becoming more productive? I think it's useful to think about resilience in this forms of diversification, flexibility, and social connectedness. These are not the kinds of things I think that most humanitarian actors are thinking about. When they think about whether or not they're ready for the next crisis, they don't really know very much about how much social networks have been able to be reconstituted since 2011. The point to make also that people who were most affected by this disaster were from more disempowered groups socially and politically than other major clans in the country is really important. And the dangers that they will continue to experience difficulty in reconstituting those social networks and in their own relationship with the major clans is a political question that Somalia is facing right now that will have a lot to do with the future of vulnerability or survival in this part of the world. There are some questions as well about what happens now that there's a different kind of geopolitics within the country since 2011. Al-Shabaab has been pushed out of quite a lot of areas in which it was still in place, certainly more urban areas than rural areas. But in those areas where Al-Shabaab is no longer present, it's worth asking what's there instead. Has the Somali federal government been able to provide service or any kind of governance capacity on the ground? And I'm afraid that in many cases the answer is probably no or very little. And that will undermine, again, people's resilience and their preparedness for the future. This point about aid being provided according to risk, I think, is really important. And I would probably add it's also about aid being provided according to access rather than need. So given the fact that there is very little humanitarian access, the World Food Programme is still not present in most places of southern Somalia in this area. Major NGOs as well, not so active. There is still a huge question around how to return to a situation or how to create a situation in which there is really a formula of aid according to need and an understanding of what those needs are and an ability to build on the resilience of those who've gone back or who've started to reconstitute their livelihoods in the years since the famine. So those are just a few thoughts. I'm happy to have discussion.
Great. Thanks very much, Laura. I'm not going to try to summarize any of that. I don't think it's necessary to, but also I want to leave plenty of time for discussion. So we've got now about 30 minutes, and it would be really interesting to hear from you in the room as well as those of you online. Your thoughts. Do you have comments and questions for the panel? So the floor is now open. If you could identify yourself and if you have any organizational affiliation, that would be helpful. And the floor is now open. And that's to our online audience as well. Bit of risk aversion here. Oh, yeah. Abdirahman.
Hi. Abdirahman from the Muslim Charities Forum. Obviously, you know that I'll be interested in the element of emerging actors and non-traditional actors. At the moment, there's all this discussion happening on the World Humanitarian Summit and how it's going to reshape aid. And interestingly enough, the conference in 2016 will happen in Turkey, and Turkey wants to play a more important role in the global humanitarian scene. And I was just wondering from your analysis, and that's the question we asked ourselves the other day, Wendy, is what's the comparative advantage between these emerging actors and the traditional ones, including in emerging actors, diaspora as such, and if there are, shared, priorities, do we see humanitarian aid in the same way or in a different way?
Thank you very much. I'll take about 2 or 3 questions before we go to the panel. Yes.
Hi, thank you. My name's Robert Piper. I'm the Regional Sahel Coordinator for the United Nations. Very interesting, and a couple of points. One is working in the Sahel. When I started this job 2 years ago, I learned very quickly that it was my role and what we were doing was very much linked with the lessons from Somalia. We really had a relatively successful response in 2012-13 in the Sahel. Sadly, because of many of the mistakes made in the Horn and in Somalia only sort of 12, 24 months earlier. A lot of issues, from having a regional coordinator to sending up sort of early warning earlier, to the disbursement of the Central Emergency Response Fund, the SURF, much faster and earlier. And I mean, we've looked at this, and so $100 million of SURF money was sort of out the door within about 6 months of the very early, within 6 months of when the earliest signals were being sent. So I think there's some important lessons there. And big money, $100 million. I mean, it was a big chunk of the SURF, I guess a quarter of the SURF's resources globally. So some good lessons that have come, that have been applied elsewhere, maybe not necessarily in Somalia, I'm not sure. Second thing is just a question about who declares this, because it's obviously, when I look at your graph and how late the response was, it was very much linked with this official declaration. Was it IGAD? Was it? So we have in the Sahel crisis, which wasn't a drought, but the crisis that occurred in 2011, 2012. We've watched different governments over a 12-month period declare the crisis, and so you can imagine the crisis was there from the beginning, but it took from the earliest, which was Niger in September 2011, to the latest, which was Senegal in April 2012, to declare the crisis. And so I think this declaration exercise is rather important, and I don't know how it worked in Somalia, but there's something there we need to build on. But again, the SURF went out way before everyone had declared, and it perhaps took some risks in that respect. And other donors, let me also recognise ECHO and OFDA, and even DFID, to a lesser extent, came out early. I say even DFID because they're not huge actors in the Sahel, but even then they were active. And the last point, sorry to be lengthy, but is on this early action agenda. I mean, I think it's all about moving faster when you do have better intelligence and early warning that something's going desperately wrong. But we're still struggling to articulate whether it's about moving the response that we would do as the crisis unfolds to earlier in the calendar, or whether there are different kinds of interventions early in the calendar that make more sense and are going to have more of a preventative effect. And I'm looking still for evidence of what we've learnt about the different nature of early interventions. Is there something, and here it becomes potentially a much more of a shared task with especially governments, but also development actors. And I think in Somalia, maybe this is it sounds a bit abstract, I guess, but because a lot of the stuff I'm thinking of governments, thinking of development actors, and they're, I guess, largely absent in the Somali context, or they were in 2011. But there's, whether you've been thinking about this early intervention, early action agenda, and whether there's something inherently different in the kinds of work we could do early on. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, here.
Thank you for hosting such an event which responds the famine of Somalia. And immediately after the famine of 2011, I wrote an article called "It is Time to Utilize Groundwater."
Sorry, could you just identify yourself?
My name is Mahmoud Elmi, and I am the co-founder of a new company called Drought Control Somalia, which is registered now as a community interest company, CIS, in England and Wales. And shortly after the famine of 2011, I wrote this article called "It is Time to Utilize Groundwater." Somalia has to utilize groundwater if looking to tackle drought and desertification. As I know, there was a breaking news in this country saying Africa sits a sea of water. It was, I think, in 2012. And making research for that, I knew that Somalia has got 223,000 kilometer cubic of water. And nobody is tapping that resource. And there is another research I made. The world has 37 mega watershed divided into 37 parts, and they occupy 26% of the total landscape of the planet. We have got one of that called Ogaden Juba Basin, involved Kenya and Ethiopia, and it occupies about 1 million kilometer square.
Mohammed, could you get to your point?
1
Yeah.
million kilometer. And so I wanted to see what's happening.
Yes.
If you don't think it's interesting, I can stop now.
No, it's very interesting, but we have a limited amount of time, so.
So I can understand that you have got a lot of guests to this time is short. Okay, my point is to tap that water, and the problem that we talk every time will be finished. People can cultivate with their wells, and they can be sedentary, not moving. So that's what I am suggesting now, and that is what I am doing now, drought control Somalia, what I want to do in Somalia. I have got many friends. One man from Italy called it Valerani system. You can Google if you want. He's a man who made a miraculous in many parts of the world with his system to regreen and make people better. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let's take one more, and then one more over here, and then we'll have another round, hopefully, if our panelists keep their responses relatively brief. Please. And if you could be as concise as possible.
My name is Butch Maley. I'm with the private sector group, the Philippine Disaster Recovery Foundation. And my question is there a role for a private sector group in situations like Somalia, especially when there are dangers involved and so on?
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to pass back to our panelists. Now, who would like to go first?
Shall I respond to the first Abdirahman's question, first of all, briefly?
Sure.
The comparative advantage of emerging actors is an interesting one, and I think to some extent, actually, we were disappointed with what we hoped would be increased access through from the emerging actors with their Islamic identity, not being so much part of the politicization of aid in Somalia. But actually, in the end, what we found is that the vast majority of their resources also ended up in Mogadishu, remained in Mogadishu, which is also where a lot of the Western aid stayed that was distributed in Somalia. So that seems like a shame. They no doubt contributed, we estimate they contributed about a third of the overall response, so what their response was certainly significant. There is a huge lack of documentation and a massive contrast between this wealth of data and reports and information from Western organisations, and very difficult to actually pin down and get your hands on facts and figures and the impact of their involvement and so on. And they certainly had a lot of the same problems in terms of gatekeepers, in terms of dealing with Al-Shabaab in Somalia. So there was no automatic sense in which these organisations, because they were had a different background, were able to reach many more people than were reached through Western organisations. And actually a lot of them were also effectively allied to or linked to the government itself, I mean Turkey most notably. So there were also questions about the impartiality of emerging actors. So just some quick responses, Abdirahman.
But just if I could add to that, and maybe Laura would like to respond to this too, but there were some significant differences. I mean, I think the most obvious one was the question of proximity and, if you will, solidarity. The Turkish agencies in particular had their own staff on the ground. They were not in many of the inaccessible areas, but they were certainly on the ground in Mogadishu and some of the areas. And there was a different perspective on the question of risk. I mean, when we interviewed some of the Turkish agencies, they would use phrases like, "We're a little bit crazy, but we're willing to go places that other people aren't," or "We take risks that other people aren't," and that was evident, and they paid for it. There were Turkish aid workers that were killed or or injured. And there's been a lot of talk about capacity building, or the emerging actors learning from the old actors. And I think that there's certainly some room for that, but I think there's a danger of a sort of a paternalistic attitude emerging there. I frankly think that both groups of actors have a lot to learn from each other. And there's been a lot of talk in the sort of Western humanitarian arena about professionalization, about minimum standards of activities, etc. And we had all those things in place in Somalia in 2011. We had the sphere guidelines, we had the HAP standards, etc. And we still didn't do a very good job of responding. The Turkish agencies and some of the other Gulf state actors and so forth were less tied into those kinds of global standards, and also less tied into the early warning mechanisms, etc. So they were as late as the Western actors were, but they were engaged in a qualitatively different kind of way. So I actually think that there's something, that maybe we have to relearn from, we meaning Western actors, have to relearn from some of the emerging actors about the spirit of voluntary action, or about what motivates a humanitarian response in the first place. To Robert's many good questions, maybe we should broaden our analysis a little bit when we talk about learning, because you're right. I think maybe some of the things that came out of the difficult experience of Somalia may be more manifest other places than in Somalia itself. So it's a good point. On the question of declaration, I think this is an area of ongoing struggle, and to be honest, it was probably easier to declare a famine in Somalia because there was not a strong state. Much as I hate to say that, because we all know that states are responsible at the end of the day for the well-being or lack thereof of their citizens. But a similar kind of exercise in South Sudan this past year was much more fraught because everything had to be cleared not only through the sort of early warning and analysis channels, but then through various ministerial channels and et cetera. Now, fortunately, there was not a famine in South Sudan to be declared, but one can imagine a much more protracted kind of negotiation, if you will, had the data actually suggested that there was a famine. The other governments in the Horn of Africa region were slow to declare a famine, to declare a crisis. There was no famine in Kenya or Ethiopia, but there was a hard-hitting crisis. And governments there were equally slow to declare. With regard to early action, and interestingly, with regard to the corollary question in terms of early warning, there has been some discussion that because we were so late to respond to the famine, and that the threshold for declaring a famine is so sort of rigorous, and the observation that we don't respond until these rigorous standards have been met, that we should lower the threshold for declaring a famine, which implies that all we would do would be to move forward the kind of responses that one does after a famine has been declared. And I think actually the evidence suggests that both of those approaches are wrong. First of all, the issue of a declaration is looking at sort of things that have already happened. So it's almost a kind of a backwards-looking analysis, if you will. I mean, to the recent past, but nevertheless to the past. Early warning is supposed to be about our best guess at what's going to happen or what's coming around the next corner. And that should be tied to things that don't necessarily just respond to a huge humanitarian crisis that's already happened, with children already malnourished, people already dying, livestock already dead, etc. But it should be aimed at preventing the death of those livestock, or enabling people to quickly sell livestock before it dies, or to be able to diversify their livelihoods in other ways, and to protect their food security and health status, so that they're able to continue to work, etc., through the famine. So there's much more of a sort of a mitigative or preventive element that should be early on, and that is embodied in the notion of both no regrets and crisis modifiers. I think this is probably spelled out the most explicitly in the livestock emergency guidelines and standard, or the legs, where there's a whole series of things that can be done in pastoral economies at the onset, particularly of drought-related emergencies, to protect the core breeding herd, to sell off through commercial channels some of the some of the rest of the herd, et cetera, to use that money in alternative ways, not to put it right back into livestock, et cetera. But we didn't find a whole lot of evidence of that. There was some in Ethiopia and Kenya, very little of that in Somalia in 2011. Do you want to say something about the private sector?
Well, just a quick couple of responses. I mean, obviously, there's no question that there's a need for for water-related interventions, but they raise a lot of complications about who owns land, processes of sedentarization and settlement that are taking place. So the sentiment is much appreciated. How you actually do that and manage that process is another story altogether. And to a certain extent, one could say the same. I think one could say the same a little bit about private organisations. There are a lot of private companies, private organisations already in Somalia, both Somali-owned as well as international organisations. And in a sense, at one level, you could say private organisations are welcome, but the political terrain that you're entering is extremely complicated. Not just in terms of security, but who you're empowering, who effectively you may be disempowering by engaging in the country.
But I mean, there was significant private sector or local business engagement in mitigating the crisis.
By Somali organizations.
By Somali companies,
about,
including some of the big ones, some of the telecommunication companies and some of the banking companies, et cetera. So I think that was more a kind of, there's already a crisis on our hands and we have an obligation to help out, rather than thinking sort of strategically by the private sector about how do we mitigate or prevent. But there's certainly an interest and an obligation there, I think.
I think what I'm going to do is take a couple more questions and then start off with Laura and move down. There were hands over here. I think Martin Barber and then Helen Young, and then we'll move on. Even though I've identified you already, please identify yourselves.
I am indeed Martin Barber. I'm a former UN official, although I never worked in Somalia. But I was working for the government of the UAE at the time we're talking about in Abu Dhabi, in a small office which has now become the UAE's Ministry for International Cooperation and Development. And I think it's probably true that a lot of the donors from the Gulf states and Turkey did not provide a lot of detailed information about what they're doing. But the UAE is a bit different, because the organization that I worked for has been providing annual reports on the UAE's foreign aid since 2009. And you can actually find quite a lot of detailed information about what the UAE-based organizations have been doing in which countries around the world. I recall from that time that one of the issues that the UAE-based organizations raised was that coordination was not taking place in Somalia primarily, nor was it taking place in Arabic. So they had to go to Nairobi and be able to take part in English. And I mean, that seems strange to them, I think it's fair to say. Also, I mean, I'm interested to see that you are still using the term emerging and non-traditional donors, even though you know that they are neither emerging nor non-traditional. What you should also know is that they don't like being referred to as emerging and non-traditional donors. And it's completely unnecessary, if you don't mind my saying so. There is a technical term that can be used in certain circumstances quite effectively, which is non-DAC donors. And that's just a factual distinction between those donors which we know most about, which are members of the DAC, and those that aren't. In this particular case, I should have thought one could simply refer to Gulf donors and Turkey, if that's what we're actually talking about. If we're talking about more than that, well, let's say so.
Thanks, Martin. Helen, and if we could be as brief as possible, because we're running out of time. We won't have time for anyone to respond. Go ahead.
Really quickly. Well, first, thanks for a great report, or a great presentation summarising a lot of complex findings, a lot of which I think will be very useful. I had a question about the connection between your finding on the characterizing resilience, the social connectedness, which presumably is also linked with institutions, extended families, clan affiliation or whatever, and the lessons you learnt from these, I don't know what to call them now, new actors, where you pointed out these positives in terms of relationships, trust, solidarity, which sounds to me like institutional connectedness. And so this kind of other area of connectedness, institutional connectedness, seems to be very ripe for, getting some positives from and overcoming, this institutional malaise seems like a bit of a blockage. It seems to me like there's a lot of positives in what you've been saying. I also wanted to make another comment about prevention. Dan, you were talking about that in your comments just now, which seems to me is also linked with understanding seasonal dynamics. And seasonality, interannual and intraannual, hasn't really been mentioned. And I wanted to ask you, do you think that in the prediction of the famines, there's been sufficient consideration of these seasonal trends as opposed to one-off, cut-off points?
Thank you. And the gentleman, actually, can I go to the gentleman behind who had his hand up for quite a long time?
Thank you. I'm Abdirahman Muhammad from African Development Trust. And I would like to make 2 points. One is, I think the most important trigger of the famine in 2011 was the shift of the farmers when they shifted from, their traditional farming of maize and the other foods consumed in Somali community, and they shifted to sesame, which have been, demanded for Arab countries and outside the country. Is there any change of course of that, or there any caution to do that again? And the second point is, during the famine, we were, the Somali aid organization is based here in UK. We were feeling that there's a lack of coordination from the Somalian government, especially the aids which are coming from the Somali diaspora communities and other Muslim communities. All those was not coordinated, and because of the capacity of the government and the challenge they were facing, fighting with Al-Shabaab or something like that. Is there any improvement in that area? Thank you.
Thanks very much. I know there are other questions, but we really are running out of time. So I'd like actually to go to Laura first for her comments, since she didn't speak in the last round. And then we'll have some very quick responses from Dan and Nisar. I don't think we'll have time to bring in Guhad and Khalif unless there's a specific issue they want to comment on. So go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on 2 things. One was the question about what tools could be used earlier. And I think one of the questions might be also about at what point do you stop, or is it appropriate to scale down support? Because we can see now that, once there's the power of, I remember the day before famine was declared. In fact, Mark Bowden, who was resident coordinator, was here at ODI at another event and said, we're going to make this announcement tomorrow, watch what happens. And suddenly it was on everyone's TV screen and everyone's talking about it. And then when famine was declared over, everyone packed their bags and disappeared very quickly. And that creates this sort of pool of vulnerability that is already sort of expanding and deepening. And so it's a question about perhaps, talking about self-reliance and, employment generation. There's a time for that is before crisis hits, before people lose their strength, and that's appropriate as a way of mitigating and slowing down the slide into destitution. But there's also an opportunity to restart that again as soon as people's resilience has built up, so that you can support that process. And I think that's a chronic problem that's happened for the last 25, 30 more years, that the mistake is always made that as soon as the so-called crisis is over, the focus on recovery is really not followed through on. That's one point. The other was the question about this uncomfortable term of emerging non-new donors. I think non-DAC donors is great, particularly when we're talking about donor country and that category. But I think one of the things that the lessons learned analysis shows is that there were so many different kinds of non-DAC donors, including the diaspora organizations, including all sorts of different kinds of groups. And I think we need to do a lot more pulling apart of that large category to understand who they are, how they functioned. As Helen says, many of them did trade on some kinds of trust networks, whether it was because of a shared faith or whether it was because they were from Turkey and everyone loves Turkey at the moment, or whatever it was. We need to know more about those trust networks, because clearly a lot of other actors on the ground don't have the benefit of those trusting relationships and probably could learn a lot from them. So that's all.
Thanks, Laura. Nisar?
Yeah, a couple of quick responses then. I think Laura's point, and it relates to the Sesame point I'm glad you brought up, is about this issue of resilience and ongoing vulnerability, and the fact that in the last 2 famines we've seen the same population groups hit, the Rahanweyn and the Somali Bantu, and that social dynamic is not very well incorporated into ongoing vulnerability analysis.
Yeah.
And some of these new patterns, like shift to sesame production, are also not very well understood or analysed at the moment. So I think, in a way, one of our biggest messages, I think, from this study is the need to improve the level of vulnerability analysis within done typically by the early warning systems. So we completely support that. And then just a quick point that Laura's touched upon, and Helen did, and Martin did, about both the Turkish and the Gulf states and the Islamic charities, and social connectedness and the links between the Islamic charities, let's say in Somali communities and Somali clans. I mean, we have developed, let's say, our understanding in that direction, but I think there is a lot more that needs to be done, and that it's almost a different type of research that needs a more prolonged engagement on the ground in Somalia. And so maybe we were able to open up some areas, but there's certainly a lot that needs to be done to understand that better.
Thanks, Dan.
Should we just see if Guhad and
Yes,
Khalif have anything?
yeah.
People have probably heard plenty from me. But
Guhad, Khalif, do you have any comments you'd like to make in response to the questions and the responses that you've heard?
Not much, but I wanted to say something more on where the gentleman has just been saying about the sesame, and he was asking any improvement. The trend and pattern of farming in Somalia has changed, as you could hear from one of the narratives. But again, the trend of the sesame growth and the sesame market is still vague, and not much information about it. And the last season, for example, there was a lot of sesame growing in Somalia, especially between the 2 rivers. And unfortunately, the sesame market was very bad, and the export of sesame market, the exportation of sesame failed, and a lot of people are keeping the business. People are keeping it. Then, when farmers grow it again, when they are growing again, nobody's buying. Then you could see again the problem is that they have shifted from the traditional farming to a cash crop farming, where again there is no proper market, or there is no they don't have even the information, the market information. There is no access to market information, where when this thing the sesame market is going to be good or not, and then which of course again will increase the vulnerability level of the farmers who initially shifted from sorghum growing to sesame growth for access for cash accessibility. Then that one failing again is again jumping from the frying pan to the fire.
Thank you.
With me is the underground water, the use of the water or the wells. Actually, there was in Lower Shabelle, where the river is, it seems that when the river dried up, there was no wells as well. That was a problem. Normally, because people use the river, now the river dried up for a long time, so there was lack of water there. And I think some organizations have realized that, and there's a lot of well drilling. My friend was saying that we can make the land green. That's not part of our study, but actually, if you use too much underground water, you will lower the level of the water, and you might lose actually whatever little vegetation you have. You see that for Saudi Arabia and parts of Australia. So you might actually go carefully. That's all I can say.
Thank you very much. Dan, any last words before we close?
People heard pony from me.
I'm sorry.
Let him get on to
Sorry,
Okay.
I'm sorry. This man didn't understand what is the water.
Sorry.
Mega watershed
Yeah.
is a water like it's a non-renewable. It's like a petroleum. It's a huge amount of water that you can. He doesn't understand that one. I'm not talking about renewable. I know what he's talking. It's not a renewable water. This is a water that you have got inside that you can use when you have got a problem.
Okay.
And it is not renewable.
Thank you very much for the clarification. I'd like to thank everyone here in the audience. We didn't have any questions, surprisingly, from the online audience. I don't know if that's a technical issue or there really weren't any. It is. So it seems we did have a technical difficulty, and I apologize to the online audience for not being able to see or have any of your questions or comments addressed. But what I'd like to do is thank everyone again for coming. I hope you'll be able to stay for a little while afterwards and join us there. I'd like to thank our panelists, Dan, Nisar, Laura, Guhad, and Khalif very much, and the CARE Regional Office again. And to remind you also that the Livestock Emergency Guidelines, the revised version, Dan mentioned these earlier, we're going to be launching that on the 9th of February here at ODI, so I hope you'll also attend that session. Thank you very much indeed.